The moment it happened, the silence that followed was louder than the explosion itself. Not the kind of silence that means nothing is happening, the kind of silence that means everyone, everywhere, at the highest levels of government, at the most classified desks in Washington, Riyadh, and Tehran, stopped what they were doing and stared at a screen. That silence is the most dangerous sound in geopolitics because it is the pause before the world decides what it is going to do next. And right now, that pause is stretching thin. Questions have been erupting across intelligence briefings, satellite feeds, and encrypted communications channels that very few people on Earth are cleared to read. Did Iran carry out a strike on the United States Military Command headquarters, located at the Naval Support Activity base in Bahrain? Did a catastrophic explosion detonate in the vicinity of the American Embassy compound in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia? These are not questions being asked casually. These are questions with the weight of history attached to them, because if the answer to either of them is yes, then what comes next will reshape the Middle East in ways that cannot be undone. To understand how we arrived at this moment, you have to go back much further than the headlines. You have to understand what Bahrain represents to American military power in the Persian Gulf, what it means strategically, symbolically, and operationally. The Naval Support Activity base in Bahrain is not just a base. It is the home of the United States Fifth Fleet. It is the nerve center of American naval dominance in an ocean that connects the energy arteries of the entire world. More than 40% of all globally traded oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz, a waterway that sits just north of that base. Whoever controls or disrupts that waterway holds the economies of Europe, Asia, and North America by the throat. The Fifth Fleet exists specifically to ensure that Iran never gets that grip. Iran knows this. Iran has always known this, which is precisely why the base has been a target in Iranian strategic planning for decades. Now, consider what a strike on the command headquarters of that base would mean. Not a strike on a fuel depot, not an attack on a supply warehouse. The command headquarters, the brain of the operation, the location where commanding officers receive intelligence, issue orders, coordinate fleet movements, and make decisions that determine whether a conflict in the Gulf escalates or de-escalates. Striking that structure is not an act of inconvenience. It is a surgical attempt to decapitate the decision-making capacity of the most powerful naval force in one of the most contested bodies of water on the planet. That is not a provocation. That is an act that blurs the line between provocation and war with terrifying precision. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, has spent years building the capacity to do exactly this. Their ballistic missile arsenal, which Western analysts conservatively estimate includes over 3,000 active missiles of varying ranges, has been modernized specifically to defeat American missile defense systems in the region. Their drone program, which has received global attention following operations in Ukraine, Yemen, and Syria, has been refined to operate in swarms, arriving from multiple vectors simultaneously, overwhelming radar and Patriot batteries through sheer volume. The IRGC does not fight the way the United States fights. They do not want a conventional war. They want to make conventional war too costly to continue. And Bahrain, with its dense American infrastructure and its proximity to Iranian territory, is the most attractive pressure point they have ever had access to. The political conditions for exactly this kind of move did not emerge overnight. They have been building for years, with a pressure that most Western audiences were never shown clearly. The assassination of IRGC Quds Force Commander Qasem Soleimani in January 2020 did not just kill a general. It sent a signal to Tehran that the United States was willing to escalate beyond the understood rules of engagement that had governed their shadow conflict for 2 decades. Iran's response at the time was measured, theatrical even. Ballistic missiles fired at Al-Assad Air Base in Iraq, with enough advance warning that American forces could seek shelter. The statement was clear. We can reach you, but we are choosing not to kill you today. That restraint was strategic. Iran did not want a full war in 2020, but they did want the world to know that restraint was a choice they were making, not a limitation they were suffering under. Since then, the architecture of restraint has been dismantled piece by piece. American sanctions have continued to strangle the Iranian economy. The nuclear deal, already gutted by the American withdrawal in 2018, has functionally collapsed as a diplomatic framework, leaving Iran with no incentive to limit its enrichment activities and no political reward for doing so. Iran has been enriching uranium at levels that have alarmed even the most optimistic non-proliferation experts, with some assessments suggesting the country is closer to weapons-grade capability than at any point in its history. Meanwhile, the proxy network that Iran has spent 30 years building across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and Gaza has been squeezed, targeted, and in several cases decapitated by Israeli and American strikes. Hezbollah's infrastructure in Lebanon has suffered devastating blows. Hamas's political and military leadership has been systematically eliminated. The resistance axis, as Tehran calls it, has taken losses that have forced a fundamental reassessment inside the Iranian leadership about what passive resistance actually costs them in the long term. This is the context in which reports began emerging about activity in and around the American military presence in Bahrain. Sources with access to regional intelligence described unusual electronic warfare signatures detected in the Gulf, signatures consistent with pre-strike reconnaissance. Satellite imagery reportedly showed movements near Iranian coastal installations that are associated with ballistic missile units. Encrypted communications intercepts, the kind that take months to decrypt and verify, began painting a picture of operational planning that went beyond the typical posturing Iran uses to signal displeasure without committing to action. This was different. The signals suggested intent, not theoretical intent, operational intent. The geography of Bahrain makes it particularly vulnerable to exactly the kind of multi-vector strike that IRGC planners have been developing. The island nation sits less than 200 kilometers from the Iranian coastline. At the speed of a modern ballistic missile, that is approximately 3 to 4 minutes of flight time. Patriot missile defense systems require several minutes to detect, track, compute a solution, and fire an interceptor. In a scenario where multiple missiles are fired simultaneously from different positions along the Iranian coast, the math becomes frightening for American defenders. Not because the Patriot system is ineffective, but because it was never designed to be a perfect shield. It was designed to raise the cost of an attack. Iran, facing a strategic situation where the cost of inaction may finally be exceeding the cost of action, may have decided that it is willing to pay that price. And then there is Riyadh. The relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran is one of the most ancient and most volatile rivalries in the modern Middle East. Their conflict is religious, sectarian, economic, and deeply personal in the way that only conflicts between neighboring powers can be. Saudi Arabia hosts American forces, American diplomatic missions, and American intelligence assets that form the backbone of the containment strategy that has frustrated Iranian regional ambitions for 3 decades. The American embassy in Riyadh is not merely a diplomatic building. It is a symbol. And in the language of asymmetric conflict, symbols carry weight that bullets cannot. An explosion near that compound does not need to destroy the building to achieve its strategic purpose. It needs to make Americans, Saudis, and every government in the region understand that the deterrence calculus has changed, that nowhere within range of Iranian capability is truly safe anymore. That the era in which America could project power from hardened permanent bases without facing meaningful risk to those very bases may be approaching its end. What makes this moment so uniquely dangerous is the simultaneity of the pressure points. In a different era, Iran would probe at one location, absorb the response, recalibrate, and probe again. The pattern was predictable and in its own terrible way, manageable. What appears to be unfolding now is not a probe. It is not a message. It is a statement. And statements of this kind, delivered through fire and concussive force, do not wait for diplomatic channels to respond. They arrive faster than the response can be formulated, faster than the press briefings can be prepared, faster than the public can be told what is actually happening. By the time the official narrative catches up with the event has already changed the world. Inside American military planning, there are contingency frameworks for exactly this scenario. The Fifth Fleet does not operate without a war plan. American Central Command does not position tens of thousands of troops in the region without having gamed out the specific possibility of a direct Iranian strike on a command and control facility. But war plans are living documents, and they are only as good as the intelligence that feeds them. If Iran found a window, a moment of reduced readiness, a shift in satellite coverage, a gap in electronic surveillance, then even the most sophisticated defense architecture has a vulnerability. History is full of moments when the most powerful military force in the world was struck, not because the enemy was stronger, but because the enemy was more patient and more willing to wait for the single moment when the gap appeared. What the world is watching right now, whether it is watching with open eyes or with the filtered lens of official statements and careful press releases, is the potential beginning of a phase that strategists have feared and attempted to prevent for 30 years. A phase in which Iran decides that the cost of strategic patience has become greater than the cost of strategic action. A phase in which American infrastructure in the Gulf, long assumed to be an unassailable deterrent, becomes the target instead of the shield. A phase in which the question is no longer whether the Middle East will ignite, but how hot the fire will burn and who will still be standing when it finally subsides. The hardest part of understanding what may have happened is separating what is confirmed from what is being deliberately obscured and understanding why the obscuring itself is significant. Governments do not suppress information about strikes on their facilities because the strikes did not happen. They suppress it because the political consequences of acknowledging the strike are, in the immediate moment, more dangerous than the operational reality of the strike itself. When a superpower is hit, the first question every allied government in the region asks is a devastatingly simple one. If they can be hit, can we? And the answer to that question determines whether the alliance holds, whether the bases remain open, whether the regional partners continue to accept American security guarantees as sufficient protection against Iranian retaliation. Silence in this context is not denial. Silence is management. This is not the first time that American installations in the region have been struck without the full picture reaching the public immediately. In the aftermath of the Iranian ballistic missile attack on Al-Assad in 2020, the initial American response was to describe the attack as causing no casualties. It took weeks for the full scope of traumatic brain injuries suffered by American service members to emerge, and even then it emerged not through official channels but through medical reporting and journalistic persistence. The institutional reflex to minimize, to contain the narrative, to prevent panic, and to preserve the perception of invulnerability is deeply embedded in how American military and diplomatic institutions communicate. It does not make them dishonest, it makes them human, but it means that the gap between what happened and what the public is told can stretch for days, weeks, or in some cases years. The situation near the American embassy in Saudi Arabia carries a different but equally layered complexity. Saudi Arabia is a sovereign kingdom with its own deep interest in controlling the information environment around security incidents on its territory. Riyadh's relationship with Washington is the kind of relationship that is strong enough to survive almost anything except public humiliation. A major security incident near the American embassy, if confirmed and widely reported, would raise questions not just about Iranian capability but about Saudi intelligence, Saudi air defense, and the Saudi government's ability to protect foreign diplomatic missions on its own soil. These are questions that neither Riyadh nor Washington wants asked loudly, in public, ahead of whatever diplomatic or military response is being formulated behind closed doors. The information being suppressed, if it is being suppressed not out of incompetence, but out of a calculated recognition that the story of what happened must be controlled before the story of what happens next can be told on favorable terms. And yet information leaks, it always does. The satellite imagery that governments cannot entirely control, the signals intelligence that gets shared among allies and then discussed in secure briefings that are not perfectly secure, the human intelligence from sources inside the Gulf who have every incentive to talk because silence serves the powerful and speech, dangerous as it is, can serve the vulnerable. What is emerging from those channels, filtered through the uncertainty that always accompanies early intelligence assessments, is a picture that is harder to dismiss than the official silence would suggest. Something happened in Bahrain. Something happened near Riyadh. The precise nature, the precise extent, the precise attribution are all still being assembled, but the direction of the evidence, the pattern of the signals, points toward Iranian involvement in a way that goes beyond the background radiation of permanent Middle Eastern tension. What does Iran gain from this? That is the question that cuts through all the tactical detail and gets to the strategic heart of the matter. Iran does not take action without calculating the return. They are not reckless. They are, in the assessment of nearly every serious intelligence analyst who has spent time studying the IRGC's decision-making culture, among the most methodical and patient strategic actors in the world. If they struck, or if they were involved in strikes at American facilities in Bahrain and near the American embassy in Saudi Arabia, they were not doing it for the drama. They were doing it to change the cost-benefit calculation that has kept American military presence in the Gulf operating with relative impunity. They were doing it to demonstrate to their own population, which has suffered immensely under sanctions, that the Islamic Republic is not a state that absorbs punishment without responding. They were doing it to signal to their regional proxies who have taken devastating losses that the patron has not abandoned them and has not been defanged. And they were doing it perhaps most critically to test the American response. Because the American response to a confirmed Iranian strike on American command infrastructure in Bahrain and near the American embassy in Saudi Arabia is the most consequential decision the United States government will have to make in the Middle East in a generation. If the response is overwhelming, immediate, and designed to degrade Iranian military capability on a massive scale, it risks a full regional war that draws in every actor in the theater simultaneously. From Hezbollah in Lebanon to the Houthi forces in Yemen to Iranian-backed militias in Iraq. If the response is calibrated and measured, it risks signaling to Tehran that strikes on American facilities are survivable, which fundamentally transforms the strategic deterrence architecture that has governed the relationship for 30 years. There is no clean option. There is no response that does not carry enormous risk, and Iran knows this. They built the dilemma deliberately, with precision, with years of intelligence preparation and strategic patience. For the people who live in this region who have never had the luxury of watching these events from a safe distance, the weight of what may be unfolding is not abstract. The Bahraini civilians who live adjacent to the Naval Support Activity base, the Bangladeshi and Indian and Pakistani workers who staff the service economy of the Gulf, the ordinary Saudi families who live and work in Riyadh, the American diplomats and their families who serve in embassies and consulates throughout the region. These people do not have a war plan. They have lives, and lives, when the machinery of superpower conflict begins to grind, are the first thing consumed. History does not announce itself clearly in the moment it is being made. The events that reshape the world rarely feel, while they are happening, like the hinge moments they will later be recognized as. People who lived through the first days of the First World War, the morning of Pearl Harbor, the hours immediately following the September 11th attacks, describe the same initial experience. A surreal certainty that something enormous had just changed, mixed with an inability to fully absorb how enormous the change would turn out to be. What is happening in the Persian Gulf right now carries that same quality, the certainty that something significant has occurred or is occurring, the uncertainty about the full dimensions of what it means, and underneath both, a deepening awareness that the world that exists on the other side of this moment may look very different from the world that existed before it. The United States has maintained military supremacy in the Persian Gulf for half a century. That supremacy has rested on a foundation of three things: unmatched military capability, a network of regional alliances, and the perception of invulnerability that deterred challengers from testing whether the capability and the alliances were sufficient. That third pillar, perception, is the most fragile. It does not require an enemy to defeat your military to shatter it. It requires only a single, visible, undeniable demonstration that your military can be struck, that the headquarters can be targeted, that the embassy neighborhood can be shaken, that the distance between Iranian capability and American vulnerability is not as vast as the deterrence architecture was designed to suggest. If that perception has now cracked, the implications extend far beyond Bahrain and Riyadh. They extend to every base, every embassy, every military installation, and every country that has accepted American security guarantees as a substitute for developing their own defense capacity. They extend to every government in the Indo-Pacific that watches how Washington responds to being struck in the Middle East and draws conclusions about what Washington would do if confronted with a similar challenge in the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea. They extend to every adversary in every region who has been watching the erosion of American deterrence credibility with the patient interest of someone waiting to understand exactly how much has changed and what it now costs to challenge the order the United States has spent a century constructing. This is not a regional story. This is the story of whether the world order that emerged from the 20th century is still functional in the 21st. And right now, in the smoke and the silence and the carefully managed official statements, that question is being answered in real time. The answer is still being written, but the first words have already been spoken in a language that does not require translation, that every government on Earth understands immediately and completely, regardless of what the press releases say. The language of fire, the language of impact, The language that says the rules have changed, the costs have changed, and the world that comes next will have to be navigated with entirely new maps. Watch this space, because what happens in the next 72 hours will tell you more about the next 50 years than anything that has happened in the previous decade.